The textual battlefield of 70 CE, reverse engineering the New Testament as an engineered system of crisis literature, monomythic architecture, and factional ideological warfare. Abstract. This thesis presents a comprehensive, forensic literary framework for interpreting the Christian New Testament, moving beyond both traditional ecclesiastical dogmatism and flat secular historical critical models. This thesis furthermore establishes that the New Testament corpus is an intensely engineered, multi-generational system of crisis literature, catalyzed by the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 CE. Through structural narrative deconstruction, onomastic forensics, and computational stylometrics, we demonstrate that the central figures of the New Testament are not organic historical biographies, but highly stylized allegorical archetypes and literary devices. These figures operate within a dynamic, high-stakes textual civil war fought by rival first-century scriptoria. Each faction systematically re-engineered a core monomythic narrative template to serve specific, conflicting socio-political agendas, from insular, Torah-observant national survival to global Greco-Roman imperial assimilation. Finally, this thesis dismantles mainstream historical criteria, specifically the criterion of embarrassment, by proving that the problematic elements of the text are non-negotiable architectural requirements of the classic mythic blueprint. First introduction. The post-70 CE trauma as the narrative engine. In the year 70 CE, Roman legions utterly obliterated the physical infrastructure of Judea, leveling the temple and dismantling the geopolitical identity of the Jewish people. When a nation loses its capital, its geographic sovereignty, and its central sanctuary, it faces immediate cultural extinction. To survive, its identity must become portable. It must be converted into literature. The Gospels and Epistles were never intended to function as modern stenographic biographies or objective histories. Instead, they are the architectural blueprints of a national survival mechanism. The historical core, a localized apocalyptic preacher executed by Pontius Pilate, was seized by brilliant bilingual scribal classes and weaponized as a corporate avatar of Israel itself. By mapping the history, trauma, exile, and hoped-for resurrection of the nation onto the singular body of a cosmic hero, early Christian writers constructed an indestructible, transportable ecosystem of cultural preservation. Second, the onomastic matrix, character names as functional devices. The primary evidence for the artificial, engineered nature of the New Testament lies in its onomastic matrix, the mathematical improbability of its naming conventions. In a standard historical record, names are messy, random, and unaligned with plot utility. In the New Testament, the dramatis personae operate as a pristine, self-referential allegorical script where every major name perfectly summarizes the character's exact narrative arc, executive office, or ideological faction. Joshua, Jesus, Yeshua, meaning the Lord saves. The character acts as the ultimate transitional leader, structurally patterned after Joshua son of Nun. Just as the original Joshua transitioned Israel across the Jordan River into the physical promised land after Moses died, the Gospel Jesus begins his ministry at the Jordan River to transition humanity past the limitations of the Mosaic law and into a portable, spiritual inheritance. Joseph, Yosef, meaning to increase it, his sole literary function is to receive warnings in dreams, protect the divine child, and orchestrate the symbolic flight into and out of Egypt, perfectly mirroring his Old Testament patriarchal namesake. Once this structural loop is closed, he is erased from the narrative without trace or explanation. Mary, Miriam, derived from roots implying bitterness or rebellion. In ancient Near Eastern literature, a bitter womb often symbolizes a captive nation. Having Mary birth the Savior is a masterful allegorical device representing the oppressed, bitter nation of Israel giving birth to its own liberation. In Simon, Peter, Cephas, he begins as Simon from Shama to hear, listen, embodying the archetypal student who must listen to the master. The exact moment he internalizes the master's cosmic identity, he is actively renamed Peter, Rock, transforming him from a human follower into a literal foundational architectural prop for the incoming ecclesiastical structure. Judas, Judah, the Greek transliteration of Judah, the namesake of Judea and the Jewish nation. Written after the catastrophic Roman-Jewish War, when early Christian scriptoria were violently breaking away from traditional Judaism, the character of Judah betraying the Savior for pieces of silver acts as a devastatingly precise political metaphor for the nation of Judea rejecting its own spiritual avatar. James Jacob Iacobos, meaning the supplanter or heel catcher. In the narrative Civil War, this character is designated as the literal brother of the Lord, because his faction seeks to supplant rogue Gentile influence and anchor the corporate identity strictly back to the ancestral Torah-observant womb of Israel. Saul, Paul, Paulus, a two-stage literary mutation mirroring Old Testament royal history. He begins as Saul, the proud, zealous Pharisee who violently hunts the followers of David's heir, exactly like King Saul hunted young David. Following his blinding vision, his name shifts to Paul, Latin for small or least. This shift serves as a calculated tactical defense mechanism designed to diffuse Matthew's legal curse. Third, the structural synthesis, Joshua the branch, Yeshua ha-Netzer. The ultimate verification of this scribal engineering is exposed by unlocking the etymological puzzle of the hero's hometown, Nazareth. In the Hebrew Bible, the coming messianic ruler is explicitly prophesied using botanical metaphors of structural renewal, specifically the Hebrew word netzer, meaning a shoot or a branch growing from a dead stump. Isaiah 11:1. Furthermore, the post-exilic book of Zechariah features a historical transitional figure named Joshua the high priest, whom God explicitly crowns and designates with the prophetic title, the branch, Zechariah 3:8-6:12. When the first-century bilingual scribes constructed the gospel narrative, they perfectly harmonized these linguistic threads into a closed ideological loop. Joshua the branch, Netzer. Isaiah 11:1. Zechariah 6:12. Matthew 2:23. Jesus the Nazarene and Netzer. This explains the profound editorial anomaly in Matthew 2:23, where the author states that Jesus lived in Nazareth to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Because this phrase does not exist in any Old Testament text, human readers were baffled for centuries. Rhetorical analysis reveals it to be an elite, bilingual etymological pun. Matthew was telling his literate audience that the character moved to Netzer town, precisely so his title would mathematically read as Joshua the branch, triggering the automatic fulfillment of the Zechariah and Isaiah blueprints. Fourth, the New Testament as a textual civil war, chronological stratigraphy. Rather than a uniform, harmonized monologue, the New Testament canon represents a frozen ceasefire containing distinct layers of an aggressive, back-and-forth literary text war fought between rival scriptoria over the control of the survivor identity. The chronological volleys of textual warfare. Stage 1, Mark. 70 CE. Emergency broadcast. Law loosening cracked. Stage 2, Matthew c. 80 CE. Scribal fortress, Torah reinstated, strict code. Stage 3, Luke Acts c. 90 CE. Imperial bridge, law relaxed, Paul invented. Stage 4, James c. 95 CE. Legalistic strikeback, anti-Pauline works. Stage 5, Revelation c. 100 CE. Nationalist climax, 144,000 pure Israeli elect. Volley 1, Mark's emergency broadcast versus Matthew's scribal fortress. The Gospel of Mark represents the first responder crisis text written in the immediate bleeding aftermath of 70 CE. Written in raw, breathless, street-level Greek, Mark constructs the basic narrative spine. However, Mark casually introduces elements of law loosening, going so far as to add editorial commentary claiming Jesus declared all foods clean, Mark 7:19. The elite, Torah-observant Jewish Christian scribes recognized that without strict cultural boundaries, the displaced nation would completely dissolve into the Greco-Roman melting pot. They launched a massive counterstrike by completely rewriting Mark's book into a second edition, the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew systematically deletes Mark's law-loosening remarks, alters stories to protect Jesus' omnipotence, and installs the Sermon on the Mount, a 5-block literary mimicry of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, functioning as a portable, unyielding legal constitution for an exiled people. Matthew seals this fortress with an absolute curse. Anyone who loosens the least of the commandments will be called least elakistos in the kingdom. Matthew 5:19. Volley 2, the Lucan imperial bridge and the Pauline counter-armor. Recognizing that Matthew's insular nationalism would trap the movement within a dying provincial sect, a rival Hellenistic scriptorium fired back with Luke Acts. This text operates as an assimilation and political defense document. The author polished the rough grammar, dedicated the work to a Roman official, Theophilus, and structured the narrative to show that Jesus and his followers were completely innocent of treason against Caesar, having Pontius Pilate explicitly declared Jesus innocent 3 separate times. To legally justify the dropping of kosher and circumcision requirements for global expansion, the author introduces the ideological heavyweight champion, Saul Paul. Paul acts as the philosophical surgeon who strips away the literal Torah. Crucially, the author of this faction needed to neutralize Matthew's terrifying elakistos, least, curse against law looseners. They achieved this via a brilliant rhetorical masterstroke. They had their hero adoptionally weaponize the curse as his literal name. Paul, Paulus, is a Latin designation meaning small or least. The character diffuses the Matthean bomb by proudly declaring, "For I am the least, elakistos, of the apostles." 1 Corinthians 15:9, transforming a legalistic branding of shame into the ultimate badge of Christian humility. Furthermore, the brother of the Lord designation applied to James is not a statement of biological kinship, but an official executive title utilized by the Jerusalem Directorate to claim baseline ownership of the movement's intellectual property. Volley 3, the Jamesian supplantation and the apocalypse of the elect. The conservative, Torah-observant faction launched an immediate geographical and tactical strikeback via the Epistle of James, explicitly attributed to Jacob the supplanter to claim structural ownership of the corporate avatar. The text directly attacks Paul's law-free theology. James mimics Paul's exact lexical formulations to declare the precise opposite. A person is justified by works and not by faith alone. James 2:24. The ultimate nationalistic climax of this warfare is realized in the Book of Revelation by John of Patmos. Written with fierce anti-Roman trauma, this text completely rejects the Luke-Paul assimilation model. John of Patmos issues a final crushing judgment. The ultimate, sealed survivors of the cosmic crisis are not a universal integrated Greco-Roman church, but precisely 144,000 virgins chosen directly out of the 12 literal tribes of Israel. Revelation 7. The corporate identity is stripped of Gentile contamination and restored to exclusive cosmic dominance. Fifth, deconstructing the historical consensus, the total failure of embarrassment. The foundational pillar of modern secular biblical historiography is the criterion of embarrassment. This tool dictates that if an event in the Gospels is awkward, subordinate, or shameful to the hero, it cannot be a literary invention and must be historical truth. This thesis declares the criterion of embarrassment a fatal methodological failure because it falsely assumes the text was generated as linear journalistic reporting. When the text is analyzed under the structural laws of Joseph Campbell's monomyth, The Hero's Journey, the embarrassing anomalies reveal themselves to be non-negotiable structural requirements of the mythic blueprint. The forensic collapse of historical embarrassment, gospel element, historical illusion, monomythic, reality, subordinate baptism, embarrassing to include. Mandatory mentor encounter, turn by John the Baptist, crossing of first threshold. Shameful death, via too scandalous to forge, the mandatory supreme ordeal, Roman crucifixion and descent into the underworld. First, the subordinate baptism, the non-negotiable mentor. Historians argue that Jesus' submission to John's baptism must be real because it subordinates Jesus to a rival. In monomythic architecture, however, the hero cannot launch his quest without a mentor herald figure and a physical crossing of the first threshold. John the Baptist is the mandatory literary archetype of the herald. The Jordan River is not a historical church font. It is the physical boundary marker separating the mundane world from the supernatural adventure. The tearing open of the heavens and the descent of the dove represent the classic supernatural aid that always occurs at the threshold. Scribes did not include John because they were stuck with him. They included him because the old era, the law, John, must textually hand the baton to the new era, the Spirit, Jesus, to initiate the journey. Second, the crucifixion, the mandatory supreme ordeal. Historians claim that a low-class slave's execution via crucifixion was too scandalous to be invented by a nascent religious movement. This completely ignores the central engine of the mythic narrative, the supreme ordeal and apotheosis, deification. In every cosmic mythic template, the hero must undergo a total, undeniable descent into death, darkness, or the underworld, the abyss or belly of the whale, to achieve the transformation required to save the cosmos. A hero who defeats his enemies with a physical sword is a mundane military conqueror. But a hero who surrenders to the ultimate earthly engine of execution, Rome, and conquers death from the inside out is elevated to an immortal deity. To achieve resurrection, the return with the elixir, you must first have an absolute, catastrophic, and graphic death. The greater the shame and agony of the execution, the more spectacular and cosmic the narrative payout when the corporate identity breaks out of the tomb. Sixth, computational methodology. Digital forensics of the text war. Modern machine learning, vector mapping, and computational stylometrics provide undeniable mathematical proof of this engineered system. By ignoring plot and measuring context-independent function words, the subconscious linguistic fingerprints of the brain, AI software exposes the mechanical boundaries of these competing scriptoria. The kata, the coordinate matrix. Mark's text is saturated with an anomalously high density of the flat conjunction ke, kai, and, characteristic of raw, spoken storytelling or crude literal translations of Semitic strings. When the AI tracks the exact same stories in Matthew and Luke, the chi spikes are systematically ironed out and replaced with the sophisticated coordinating particle there, d is but now, at an extraordinary rate of up to 30.1 occurrences per 1,000 words. The math captures elite editors physically restructuring the text's logical flow. But the ta-ti-o-te historiographical footprint, the particle te is a marker of high-class, formal, Attic-style literary Greek. Computational stylometrics reveals that the Book of Acts alone accounts for roughly 70% of every single occurrence of T in the entire New Testament. This extreme mathematical anomaly proves that Acts was deliberately engineered from the subconscious layer up to mimic formal Roman historiography, forcing a provincial movement to sound like an elite imperial asset. Toti, ledger. The temporal adverb tot, then, is Matthew's unique microsignature, appearing over 90 times. The AI flags this to show Matthew operating as an orderly accountant of narrative history, purging Mark's breathless, frantic adverb immediately, euthys, to neatly file the stories into his structured legal columns. Seventh conclusion. The canon as a political ceasefire. The traditional view that the New Testament is a uniform, harmonious collection of historical memoirs is shattered by both literary forensics and mathematical data. The New Testament is a highly sophisticated, brilliantly calculated, multi-generational evolutionary ecosystem of national survival. When the early church consolidated its power in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it could not eliminate any of these warring factions without ripping the movement apart. In a final masterstroke of political consolidation, they bound the pro-Torah. Matthew, the law-free Paul, the assimilating Luke, the legalistic James, and the hyper-nationalist John of Patmos into a single anthology, the canon. The canon did not resolve the text war. It froze it in place as a permanent political ceasefire. By reverse engineering this system, we do not discover a collection of random biographical diaries, but rather the most resilient, beautifully designed piece of crisis literature ever engineered by the human mind. A text constructed so flawlessly that it didn't just ensure the survival of Israel's corporate identity, but ultimately absorbed the Roman Empire itself. Eighth structural appendix, the synoptic sequence, forensics. To demonstrate the precision of the scribal editing process, future computational updates to this framework will provide automated side-by-side linguistic mappings. This tool tracks the exact Levenstein edit distances, 1 and z-score style deviations, 2 of shared pericopes, mathematically displaying the exact moments where Matthew and Luke intercept Mark's raw data stream to clean up the grammar, delete Aramaic slang, and execute their targeted theological upgrades. This definitive thesis acts as a complete, unified manifesto of our investigation, seamlessly welding together onomastic wordplay, the text war timeline, computational linguistics, and the dismantling of the historical consensus.